Want to learn what it takes to create VR games for the PSVR? Then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive content specialist focused on e-learning and training. I'm also the creator and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Daniel Kallander, a game designer for fast travel games with over 4 years of VR experience and the co-founder of the Stockholm VR Meetup. Today, Daniel will be sharing his insights on how to create VR games for the PSVR. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free, and registration gives you access to all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the Register for Free button. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. All right, Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. We actually did an Altspace VR event. I believe it was for VR Day, wasn't it?
Yes, definitely. It was in November, I think.
I think so. Last year seems like forever.
Yeah.
But I remember it was very, very fun. So thank you for being on the podcast. And one of the things that intrigued me was that you worked on various VR games, but one of them was for the PSVR. And I told you, hey, I think it will make for a great podcast episode. So I'm glad you agreed to be here.
Yes, and I'll be able to talk as much as I can about it.
Yeah, we'll give you a little disclaimer to everybody that, speaking about Sony and PSVR stuff is not as free as it is with perhaps other independent games, right? So we know you are within the confines of the Sony agreements and, we'll go from there. But before we get started, why don't you just give us a quick background about yourself, how you got into gaming, how you got into VR specifically?
Well, gaming has always been a part of my life. Like even my grandparents played Mist and Riven when I was a kid. So I've been watching them from the sidelines. Playing that with pen and paper as a young child. But for me personally, I got into games development quite late comparatively. When I was 21, I had a choice of, I had already done a year of college and failed that, doing product design. And thought, I'm going to do something more fun. And I found that there was very nearby where I used to live, there was a game design education. And I was like, what could go wrong? And now, almost 8 years later, I'm here. A couple of years of experience with VR development and everything. Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
How did you get into VR itself, like VR gaming, both as a creator and also just as a gamer itself?
So I've always been fond of the idea of VR ever since I was a kid. But my first experience was related to my university degree, education. I never finished a degree. But it was right around the time when the Oculus had its Kickstarter. Early 2013, I went to the faculty department and asked, hey, can you buy some of these headsets so we can do some experiments? And they said, no, we'll buy you 4 so we can test multiplayer. And I was like, yes. So the first VR experience I tried was probably, I don't remember it. I think it was Tuscany, like the first test thing that they had for the Oculus Rift DK1. Either that or the very old Unreal Engine roller coaster demo back in the day. That was probably the first thing. And as a creator, I actually got started pretty quickly. We got the headsets to the university in June 2013. And in August 2013, Oculus had their first VR Jam. And me and a couple of other students got together and, hey, we have a summer vacation during August. We might as well do something. We're game development students. Sounds like up our alley. And we failed miserably. It was definitely the first project that ever done in a real sense, like outside of school. And yeah, I'm not going to mention the name of that entry because it's so horrible to look at.
But I'm sure you learned a lot, right? Failure is always a good thing for learning.
Yes, and we did everything wrong that you can in a project. We, of course, as the ambitious game design students we were, We tried to make an RPG because, of course, we did. And we were like our second attempt to make a game in Unity at all. It was fun times. Happy I did it, but yeah, I'm not going to look back at that code or that artwork.
What's your favorite experience today? VR experience?
There's so many, but one of my favorites has been this one that I've actually been keeping track on, sort of in the background, ever since it was created back in the day. But just recently, after a VR meetup here, a attendee showed me what has happened with VR chat. And they invited me to this one of the worlds that, guessing that users of VR chat will recognize a tree house where the sky dome is basically a shader, and you can switch the sky dome into whatever you want. So they changed it into a fractal pattern, and they had these jetpacks that you could fly around inside the fractals. And I was like, holy shit, we can do this with VR today, and it's all running across platforms, across VR, and we're having this full body tracking experiences. That kind of blew my mind that we're able to do that.
So how did you get into PSVR development? Because obviously you started doing games, then you started doing VR, and what made you decide to start doing VR specifically for Sony PlayStation?
Sort of fell into it as a part of just another task at work. My first experience with PSVR was before I started working at Fast Travel, a game that was never released for PlayStation, so I'm not going to say which game in case the company ever decides to actually go through with that. But I was basically responsible on the tech side for the PSVR development, and we had a game that we're making for VR, and it just made sense that here's this huge platform that we might as well develop for as well. Like, developing for Vive and Rift is often easier, and we'll touch on a bit of why, but just felt like a natural progression to, if we're doing 6-3 motion gaming for VR, why not also target PSVR development? That seems to be the biggest platform today.
Definitely. I think it's got a couple of million installations, right? If I'm not mistaken.
I'm not sure about the official numbers, but yeah.
It's pretty large.
Something like that.
So how was that transition? Because you were developing games in VR already, but for the desktop. So how was that transition into learning how to develop games for the PSVR? What things did you have to learn or relearn?
Not much, actually. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to just doing a basic game for both the Vive and the Rift. Most of the differences comes from it being a console title, not necessarily specifically PSVR.
What do you mean by that? Can you expand on that? What do you mean by most of the difference it's because it's a console title?
Yeah, so like you still have your target hardware, and this is not like PS4 or PSVR specific, but consoles have set hardware that you need to target, and for that comes hardware that you use as a developer. And navigating around that is sometimes a hassle, sometimes not, and it's definitely a different experience than creating for, say, all the NVIDIA cards above 970, as you do for Rift and Vive, and developing in a very set environment, as opposed to like PCs, and which have all the different kinds of generalized CPUs and GPUs.
So in that sense, wouldn't it make it easier to develop for the PSVR because then you know exactly what hardware you're developing for and there's not variance of that?
In some ways, yes, definitely. You have more of a sense of what can I do with the hardware, where are the limitations. You also know that, okay, each player will have the same, for both Vive and Rift, we have quality settings, depending on what kind of hardware a player has. And for that, it requires a lot of development from our side to actually segment content in terms of quality. Like, okay, these are the shaders, these are the materials that fit for one quality setting but can't run on another. Those sort of things are something that we need to consider for PSVR. Then you have the hardware. You know what you're getting out of it. And if you're hitting your target frame rate, you're hitting your target frame rate. That's not going to change. User can't do anything to change that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What kind of technologies and tools do you need to learn? Like, are you using Unity? What kind of languages?
That's actually not that different at all. Unity always flaunts with their cross-compatibility across engines and devices, and PS4 and PSVR is no exception. It's very easy to use. Like, the actual game-making process is not that different at all.
Well, but let's say for like polygon count, I mean, are there specific best practices you recommend when you're doing it for the PSVR, knowing whatever the limitations are?
Nothing that's really specific to PSVR in general. There are certain tools that you can get access to, but that's behind the developer portals that Sony provides. So that's nothing I can comment on.
I see. But Sony provides tools that are plugins or whatever, but are these tools that you would use in addition to Unity for integrating into the hardware?
Not beyond the sense that, of course, it's different hardware than just your regular PC that you want to be able to play on. So obviously there's some translations going on there, but the actual tools that you use to make your game is the same, basically. You would have some differences between, say, PC and Android systems in terms of shaders and what you can do with the hardware. The same applies for a console hardware as well. There are some specific ways that they configure their hardware, in most cases, in order to get more power out of it. But that can benefit you or hinder you, depending on what you want to do for other platforms. And that's nothing that's Sony or PSVR specific. That's a way of hardware development and software development for dedicated hardware.
So how do you test games on the PSVR? Do you sideload them into it, or do they give you a specific developer portal where you can upload it and then run it from there? How is that testing done?
That is all behind NDA. I cannot answer. Of course, we as developers can test on our own devices and stuff like that, but whatever's beyond that, I cannot talk.
That's interesting that they put that on NDA for testing purposes, but I totally understand.
Well, it's not specifically, you can't talk about testing, it's just related to other things. That's
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So maybe this question may end up having the same answer to it, but if you want to do a closed beta, like you want to invite people to test your game, obviously in Steam, you could just send them a file for Windows and they could just run it, right? Can you share how that can be done, like a closed beta for PSVR games, or pretty much NDA as well?
Yeah, no comment, actually. I hate to say that, but no comment there.
Okay, that's cool. So the Sony VR games are purchased through the VR store, right?
It's just PlayStation Store.
So without going into all the details, what is the process of submitting? Is there a review period? Do they give you feedback? At a high level, can you share the process of that?
Well, if you take into consideration like what you do for Steam and Oculus, there's not that much different in terms of what kind of processes that take place. There is a application process, there is a building and testing process, and there's a submission process, basically. And I can't talk to the specifics of to what extent they're different on PlayStation, but the one thing I can say is, whereas Oculus and Steam are one platform, Sony Interactive Entertainment, which people refer to when they say like Sony or the PlayStation, that's split into different regions. And every region has their own laws and regulations that you need to follow. So some way along the line, the submission process gets divided into those specific regions. And that comes with stuff like, say, you're doing a game for Europe, you might want to consider having a French localization or Russian localization, which you wouldn't necessarily consider if you're doing a game for USA.
I would imagine also there's some laws that, do you get into a situation where perhaps you have to adjust the game a bit because you've done something in the game that is okay in one country, but it's illegal in another country, whatever that may be, right?
We haven't been in that situation as far as I know, on the games I worked on, but that's really not Sony exclusive. That's just a thing of this specific country.
I guess in general.
Yes, like I know Germany has a lot of laws against showing blood and stuff like that. But again, that's what the country has decided. And of course, as Sony does provide, if you choose to make it, you can do physical releases. And then that becomes more of a serious, you get a lot more regulations and laws around that for actually releasing in a country, as opposed to just releasing something on the internet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have to show Sony your idea prior to start working on it? In other words, does Sony have to approve an idea, or you can just do whatever you want and then just submit it to the store?
I mean, again, just like Oculus or Steam, they are to some degree, not as much Steam anymore, but they all are aware and they want to have good games on their platforms. I can't touch on like the specifics on what the process is like, but it's nothing that people should be worried about. That's much I can say.
But they provide guidelines, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not like, hey, you need a 40-page PowerPoint presentation with a playable demo and like everything detailed out specifically. Otherwise, we won't release your game, sort of thing. It's not that hard. But there is a acceptance process of it. But say you're a developer that has a game on Rift and Vive, you should have no trouble becoming a Sony developer.
All right. Was there anything else you'd like to share about developing for PSVR? If you can give a developer wanting to create games for PSVR any one tip that you want them to know before they jump into it?
There's actually two. First and foremost, I would like, despite all of my, oh, this is NDA, that's NDA, I would definitely encourage any developer to go for it and do a PSVR title, either as just PSVR or multi-platform purposes. Yes, the tracking sucks. They're aware as well. But the games, our CEO just released the percentages that we've sold across the different platforms. And we're on both PC and PlayStation for VR. That's basically 6 degrees of freedom in both controllers and headset. And our sales are almost 60% PSVR. So it makes sense from like a business perspective because a lot of players are there. And that's with a game that's Move controller required. As far as I've heard, just in the rumor mill, like there's a lot of gamers out there that doesn't have the Move controllers. They used to have DualShock for PSVR. And for us as a game to actually do that well comparatively across the platforms, despite that, says a lot about the platform. Beyond that, beyond just like recommending it wholeheartedly, despite the NDAs and the scary stuff that you hear about Sony and everything like that, I would also highly recommend, if you do a PSVR game, get in touch with the community. That includes both PSVR Reddit. They're great, both as the commenters and the moderators there are amazing for us developers. And I would also strongly recommend to reach out to the different PSVR YouTubers that exist. People like PSVR Frank, who's just an amazing guy, and people like PSVR Without Parole, a couple of other YouTubers. They're all great people. They're just enthusiastic about the platform. They love to showcase great content. So if you have it, they'll happily share it with the world for you.
Oh, those are great tips. Well, thanks for sharing. You know, we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you one last question, which I ask all of my guests when they come, is describe what you would like VR to be like in the future. Not what do you think it'll be like, but what you would like it to be like.
My answer to this sort of comes back to what I talked about in the beginning. Like I've had a dream of VR since I was a kid, and there's one specific scenario I want to be able to like experience. And that's when I know that the level of VR has come to my sort of expectations. And that's me being able to stand in an environment, say a crop field or something like that, and be able to feel the passing of the wind, both on their skin, in their hair, on their face, and then maybe summer rain, like light summer rain starting falling, and you can feel the individual droplets, stuff like that. And just having that level of feedback, both from you as a person to the world and from the world to you as a person, and having that sort of connection and feedback back and forth. When we have that, then that's when I feel like now VR is actually here.
That sounds like it would be an amazing experience.
I agree.
Well, cool. Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time being on the podcast and sharing the knowledge that you are able to share that is not under NDA. No, but really, all kidding aside, thank you so much for sharing the information, because I know this will help a lot of people that are looking to start developing for the PSVR. If people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give them contact info?
Sure. So I'm always on Twitter at DK, DEEKEJ. Otherwise, check out Fast Travel Games. I mean, we released a game almost a year ago now. We have been doing stuff since. Exactly what, I can't talk about yet. But suffice to say, we'll have stuff to show in 2019 when we're ready. Almost a year ago now, we released Apex Constructs. First for PSVR, and then for both Vive and Rift. So, well, for Steam VR and Rift. So even if you have a Windows headset as well. You can download it and play it. It's still being updated from community feedback, stuff like that. So play it, let us know what you think. And yeah, hope you enjoy it.
Well, thanks again, Daniel. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. Just a quick reminder, if you want to access all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more, register for free at howtocreatevr.com. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.